Thank you for joining us, everyone, for this session about trauma, COVID-19, and the college classroom. We just want to thank our attendees for joining us on the Forum for Excellence 2020, and specifically for this session. We're joined today by our presenter, Shanna Shipman, and she's going to inform us about the topic for today's session. Shanna, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Kirsten. And truly, thank you, everyone, for taking the time to tune in today and join us. This is a big topic, and we'll barely scratch the surface today, but we'll at least get started. And please know there will be more opportunities to learn about trauma and what it means for our instruction in the future. But we'll go ahead and dive right in, and we always start with why. Why are we here? Why do we care? Why are we talking about this? So when we pause on this question, why become trauma aware? There are several ways to look at it, and one just might be acknowledging the fact that trauma is alive and well in our world, within each of us. No one is immune to trauma. We all have trauma to varying degrees and in various ways. And sometimes it plays out in our classrooms on all levels. So it's really not a reality that we can afford to ignore. And it's also a humane and more effective way to approach teaching and learning. So I have this image of the lenses, the glasses. I think this is one lens through which we can look at our learners and help us to understand them better, understand their backgrounds, their experiences, and how that may impact what their needs are to best be successful in the classroom. At the end of the day, a trauma-aware classroom is a more equitable classroom. A trauma-aware approach really acknowledges neurodiversity in a very specific way. And we'll get more into the neurological impacts of trauma in a bit. But recognizing this kind of invisible diversity amongst our students allows us to really adapt what we do in a way that's helpful across the board for all, but more proportionally helpful even for learners in our classroom who have undergone trauma and may be living the effects of trauma. So just to preview today's objectives, we really, I hope, will deepen understanding of how different experiences, especially adverse experiences, impact us. We also want to consider trauma in the context of now, fall 2020, and all the extreme unique considerations surrounding us and surrounding this process of learning in our post-secondary institutions. And last, I hope we'll examine the impact of trauma on learning a little more closely so that we can walk away from this hour together with a slightly more trauma-informed instructional approach. But let's just make sure we have a common understanding of what trauma is. We talk a lot about stress and how it impacts us, and we want to distinguish trauma as something different. And I like to think of trauma in reference to the 3 E's: an event, experiences, and effects. So trauma is an event or series of events that are experienced by an individual as harmful or maybe even life-threatening. This overwhelms a person's ability to cope. That's really a defining factor when we're talking about trauma, and therefore has adverse effects on that individual's functioning in life and really their social, physical, emotional, mental, spiritual well-being. So it's these additional factors, this overwhelming of a person's normal ability to cope with stressors and the lasting effects that distinguishes between stress and trauma. Individual trauma responses vary, and this is due to a variety of factors. It may be stage of development or age or just how one has developed in their lifetime. Temperament plays a role. It's really about how one perceives an event. You and I might experience the exact same event, and one may find it to be quite traumatic and one may not. This might depend on our histories, experiences in the past, especially related to trauma. This might depend on once the event has happened, what happened next. Were we able to process or have assistance with that, or have nurturing relationships help us through, nurturing circumstances help us through? And that really lends to this last factor of support systems. Support systems have been shown by research to be incredibly important in regard to how we respond and process trauma. So we'll definitely be speaking to that, because that's really where your role as a post-secondary instructor comes in. We'll talk a bit more, though, first about types of trauma. Many times we think of trauma as a one place in time event that happens. I was in a car accident. I was abused. I had suffered the loss of a loved one. Acute trauma is what we refer to as these single, sudden, and usually unexpected events that really impact us for the long haul. This is different than chronic trauma, which can happen over time. And really then we start talking about repeated events. This again may refer to an instance of abuse in our relationships with others. One thing that really comes to mind when I speak of chronic trauma is the role of poverty and economic hardship, because not only does that bring with it intense stressors, but it brings circumstances often when our time and energy and resources are stretched thin that put us at risk for other sources of trauma. So poverty is a big part of this conversation when we talk about chronic trauma. Maybe you know someone who is chronically ill and there is trauma involved with that over time. These are all examples. When we start to talk about complex trauma, we describe exposures to multiple traumatic events throughout a lifetime and how that really impacts one's development. So that's similar to chronic trauma. It's really talking about the interplays of various sources of trauma and how they might impact an individual over time. And I think it's very, very important to touch on this last idea here of historical, sometimes we call it cultural trauma. Here we're really talking about collective trauma of a group over time, over generations. Maybe this stems from oppression, discrimination, mass displacement, efforts at mass extinction. We can think of many examples throughout history where a group of people have really absorbed a level of intense trauma as a subgroup of our society that is then passed on through generations, not only because the circumstances of their lives are still difficult, but because that trauma is kind of psychologically, emotionally passed on as well. I think this is really important to consider in the context of today. Again, fall 2020, we have some serious societal and racial tensions playing out in our communities. And many would argue that this is the result of these historical traumas that are just below the surface coming to play. So I think it's important to pause on that. The fact of the matter is, when our students come into our classrooms, and whether it's in person or virtual, we don't know what types of trauma they may have experienced and when and how it might have affected them. And I don't think the key is to try to figure out, quote, who has had trauma. I think what we're speaking to today is really a blanket awareness that, again, helps us see all learners differently and therefore adjust our practices in a way that can benefit all, even if we're not aware of the traumas of the individuals in our classrooms. You know, because we're speaking today about our specific profession, teaching at the post-secondary level, teaching non-traditional students, teaching students of all adult ages, teaching career and technical education programs, people who are eager to be at school or come back to school to learn new skills to put into play. We can talk a bit about what kind of traumas play out on college campuses, but of course, we'll also keep in mind that many of our students don't live on campus, and right now, many of us are learning remotely. But it's still important, I think, to mention that there are traumas specific to college campuses that we have to keep in mind as instructors. Sexual assault is one. The numbers for this are huge, and that's even though we know they are vastly underreported. 1 out of every 5 women, it's estimated, will suffer some form of sexual assault while in a college setting. There are alcohol and substance-related illnesses and accidents and issues. Some of our college campuses have suffered mass violence or the scare of mass violence in ways that stick with students. But today we also shift to really include this idea of current context, as we said, and what's happening right now and what that can mean for trauma on a college campus. So we're talking about illness related to COVID-19, economic hardship, isolation, and just worry for our loved ones, even if these things aren't impacting an individual. So it's important just to take note, special circumstances right now. So what are we experiencing right now as a society? We can think of trauma on so many levels. We think of it as an individual, or maybe a class, or a subgroup of our society, a family, a community. There are some collective things that we're experiencing that we're talking about right now as we see unprecedented levels of both stress and trauma related to things like physical safety, our own well-being, economic security, as many folks find themselves out of the workforce because of the ongoing pandemic. For those of us still working, there are new work demands. Perhaps we are absorbing new responsibilities or having to do things in a very new way. If we're working remotely, that brings its own hosts of challenges and stressors. There's social unease as we're out and about and wondering about our exposure level with other people. There's isolation as we try to limit that exposure. We know there's domestic relationship strain. We also know that there are increased levels of domestic violence and abuse going on as folks are more isolated, more stretched, more pulled thin as they try to make ends meet in this new context. As I said, we're experiencing a collective societal, political, racial reality that's extremely traumatizing for many folks, especially if they feel that their own families and communities are impacted deeply. And we absorb stressors and trauma just through watching the news, what's happening in the world. And our nature is to be empathetic and compassionate, and we absorb these things. So at the risk of, let's all just take a deep breath and a heavy sigh, at the risk of really painting a glooming picture, we need to acknowledge that things are different right now. What else might we be experiencing? The neurological impacts of all this trauma. And I think I'd like to pause here. This is really, if you walk away with nothing today, please walk away with this concept strong in your mind, that trauma is a neurological issue. It really has to do with the brain and how it functions. Trauma is a brain issue. It's a cognitive issue. It's a learning issue. And that's really where our direct connection as instructors comes in. We need to understand the effects of trauma on the brain so we can understand the effects of trauma on our end goal, which is learning, the success of our students. So we could go very deep into the neuroscience, but we won't today. But we will pause just to make note of this idea that if we divide our brain into our survival brain, that brain stem, lower part, the back of our head, that keeps us alive with basic functions and also monitors for threat, sounds an alarm if we're in danger, activates our responses to that danger. That's different than our thinking brain. Think of that the frontal cortex of our brain that's right in the front, and really focusing more on rational thought, decision making, judgment, emotionally controlling those impulses. Sometimes we can refer to it as our rational brake. We slam on the brakes with our thinking brain, and before we act, we think things through rationally. During a threat, this goes offline. So if this goes offline, it has to serve this other function of bringing the body back into balance. When we're or bringing the brain as well back into balance. When we cannot come back into balance, that's when we talk about overwhelming our coping mechanisms. That's when we're talking about trauma. When that emotional or survival brain continues to sound an alarm, so maybe we've experienced something that stuck with us in a way, and we still feel elevated because of that experience. It can take many forms. We think of fight or flight. Fight meaning, taking an aggressive posture. Flight meaning getting away, avoiding issues. There's also this idea of freezing. And sometimes I think this is really misunderstood in classrooms across America for learners of all ages. Somebody kind of spacing out or slouched back in their chair and seeming disconnected from what's going on. That could just be disengagement. That could just be a tired student. That could be a lot of things. It could be a trauma response. And I've certainly seen this a lot in the populations I've served. And it can be very misinterpreted. And it can be seen as offensive to an instructor if they don't understand what's really going on. Some of the literature is now talking about a fourth response, this idea of a fawn response, just really working hard to please everyone around you, to avoid confrontation, avoid conflict because of traumas you've had in your past. We can divide these ideas into hyperarousal and hypoarousal. In hyperarousal, we're up, we're emotional, we're agitated, we're overreacting. Maybe in the case of a pandemic, we're panic buying because we're fearful of what's to come and the unknown. Oh, I'm really guilty of one of these, which is obsessively watching the news, needing to know at all times what's happening, trouble relaxing, difficulty sleeping, and we're also seeing increased use of substance abuses, absolutely at this time. Hypoarousal is when we're down, feeling emotionally disconnected, withdrawing, hard to get out of bed, feeling foggy or numb. I know I've been feeling really foggy when things are intense, like cognitively, just can't quite figure things out as sharply as usual. Kind of the spacing out effect that we just talked about, feeling depressed or down and changes to appetite and sleep. So here are some of the signs. Will you see some of these signs in your classrooms? Maybe. Most of them you won't see in your classrooms, but certainly we see in classrooms, again, for learners of all ages, these things can be misinterpreted. We also need to be thinking about trigger responses. This idea that reminders of past traumatic experiences could cause one to react as if the event is happening again. These responses, again, can appear confusing and out of place. They can be misunderstood. I can think of things in our learning environments that may be triggers for folks. Some might seem obvious, like a loud noise, unexpected motion of other people in the room, changes in the lighting, other changes in the environment. So really, those are some obvious ones. Others may be less obvious. Others might have to do with the content or what we're discussing in class. If we're making reference to experiences that maybe are a trigger for an individual, we might be really unaware of that. We might be unaware that if we talk about a certain occurrence that happens in our society, that someone might take that very personally and feel a triggered response. So certainly I'm not saying we have to filter or water down the way we interact in our classrooms. We're not machines, we're humans, and none of us can know exactly what can impact another person, but just adopting this idea of a lens of trauma awareness can help us to kind of rethink some of the things we either discuss in class or some of the environmental factors of our learning environments. Because really the key is learning. Let's get a little bit more into the neuroscience behind how trauma can impact learning. What we see, and again, this is for learners of all ages, trauma can really impact your ability to process information and language. I've heard individuals who are dealing with a trauma response describe a learning situation such as they're listening and they hear that the instructor's talking, but none of the words make sense. And that's something that's a common account of what folks experience. Difficulty regulating emotions, attention, behavior, that can all be related to trauma. Really difficulty forming the relationships with this as adults and peers. We're really talking about maybe instructors and peers. That can be difficult, and that's too bad because we know that relationships are one of the top factors for really combating the effects of trauma and building resilience. So we'll get more into that in a bit. But I've been talking for a very long time. I'd love to bring you into this exchange a little bit, and maybe we can just pause and you consider these things. And if any of this strikes you in a certain way, maybe you can share your thoughts in the chat box. But I'm just curious if you think there's any way that trauma responses might be misinterpreted in either the classroom in which you're currently teaching or courses that you've taught in the past. As we talk today, is there anything that comes to mind, or is there, we won't share names, of course, but are there any particular students that come to mind where you think back and you say, wow, you know, that was really a tough mystery for me to crack, and I'm really wondering if individual trauma might have had something to do with the way that particular student was interacting with our course or interacting with the content or interacting with you. So there's one question. Another is, how might, quote, regular learning experiences, the things we do all the time in a post-secondary context, impact a learner dealing with trauma or even trigger additional trauma? Are there things coming to mind where you're thinking, oh, maybe I would do that differently? Or I've noticed this in a lot of, you know, post-secondary contexts. Maybe that's something we should rethink. So anyway, these are questions to just pause on, to consider. And quite honestly, if you have thoughts about this or anything else, feel free to keep putting these things in the chat box. I am really appreciating anyone who's already sharing. Thank you for that. Folks, feel free to take a look at those things as we go. So yes, open invite. Please share your ideas about these questions or anything coming to your mind thus far about what we're learning about trauma. So let's start talking about the good news. And let's do so in regard to this concept of resilience. Resilience is a positive, adaptive response to adversity. Resilience is the overcoming of trauma. And I think it's important to talk about because as educators, we can play a key role. Some of the things that really help as far as the promotion of personal resilience and growth from trauma are an adaptable, caring, supportive relationship or more than one. This is really the top factor as far as people really recovering from traumatic events and really exhibiting resilience in the face of trauma. And again, by resilience, we mean the ability to cope and go on functionally in their lives. So relationships are key. As instructors, you don't have to be your student's best friend. You don't have to know their favorite color or their favorite football team, but it's amazing how just the smallest gestures of care can be extremely impactful for all learners, but especially those who are undergoing the effects of trauma. So again, just keep connecting in your classrooms. And it's hard to do virtually. Many of us are teaching more and more virtual courses because of what's going on in the world and also because of trends in education. It's hard to do, but there are specific techniques for sure that can help you to connect virtually. And a lot of it has to do with time and just taking the time to pose some questions or get to know you type of activities with your learners, to check in with your learners, to shoot personal messages as time allows to your learners. So we'll think of all of these things in a virtual context as well. Here are some other things that maybe are more intrinsic to the actual individual. The sense of mastery over life circumstances. You know, where is your sphere of control? What do you feel in control of and what do you not feel in control of? There is research-based evidence that really shows a link between how much control one feels over their own experience or their own life and how well they are able to cope with trauma. So that's an idea to explore. And that can be molded and shaped even for people who are undergoing extreme circumstances that make them feel very lacking control in their lives. This is a mindset that can be intentionally cultivated over time. Strong executive function and self-regulation skills can really help with trauma, but in the reverse, trauma can impact these things and be detrimental towards these things. So that's a tough cycle. Safe, supportive environments. This is where our learning institutions come in. We can have a trauma-informed system and a trauma-informed institution that really sets the tone for what we do as students. And faith and cultural traditions and really affirming those in the classroom can be extremely helpful. This isn't the promotion of a specific faith. This is affirming individual faith systems as we hear them come up in our classrooms, and also cultural traditions. Cultural responsiveness, cultural sensitivity, cultural humility are all terms that we use in the post-secondary educational world. All of that really has to do with centering another person's culture and having an open mind and acknowledging the strengths and values of that other culture, as opposed to judging another culture through the lens of our own. So those are some heavy concepts, but the good news here is that resilience can be nurtured. A few more notes on resilience. It's not an all or nothing thing. It's not, I've recovered from trauma or I haven't, or I'm a resilient person or I'm not. We're all on a gray scale. It's a process for all of us. Many factors, as we just mentioned, can influence this resilience building process. It varies by situation. We know it varies by individual. And resilience can be supported at any age. Certainly our K-12 education systems are focusing quite a bit on trauma and how to help children to come over their adverse childhood experiences. But this can be supported at any age, so this is completely relevant as we talk about our adult learners. Resilience is intrapersonal. It has to do with how you respond to your own thoughts and feelings, and it's also interpersonal. And as we've discussed, can really be supported by our relationships. So when we say we as an individual professional or our system or our staff has a trauma-informed approach, that's a pretty broad term, but it really comes down to these 4 ideas, I think. And again, we're going to stick with the alliteration. This time we have 4 R's. So a trauma-informed approach realizes just the widespread impact of trauma, the prevalence of trauma. We did not take time to dig into the numbers, but they're pretty dramatic. And when you look at how many people have experienced traumatic events, how many traumatic events they have experienced, how many traumatic events happen to early ages, at very developmentally sensitive times. This is really where this influence on trauma came to be. There was a Kaiser study on adverse childhood experiences that traced childhood experiences and trauma to outcomes later in life. This is an insurance company's study because what we saw was that childhood traumas led to things like substance abuse and other destructional behaviors and even suicide and other things later in life. So we're starting as a society and definitely as educators to recognize the impact of trauma and how prevalent it is, as well as those potential paths for recovery. We want to recognize signs and symptoms of trauma when we can in our learners and our fellow staff and ourselves. So realizing and recognizing are two kind of different ideas. Again, we're not asking folks to be mental health professionals. We know our limits. We're just asking folks to put on a trauma-aware lens. And we can learn more and more all the time about how to do that. A trauma-informed approach responds by integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, practices. This can be very simple. One simple example that has shown to be effective is when instructors include information about trauma and how to seek mental health help on the syllabus. Welcome to our college, welcome to our course. Here are some services that are available to you. So just putting that information in prominent places could be one example of integrating knowledge about trauma into what we do. And again, we're going to focus on this idea of triggering. We seek to actively resist re-traumatization. If you know there's an individual in your class that responds to a certain stimulus in a way that evokes this secondary trauma, we avoid that as an instructor. We can't always know, but when we do know, we do better and we adapt. That is that final characteristic of a trauma-informed approach. We can talk about concrete practices in our instruction that really promote a more resilient atmosphere for learners. One of these that I think is really important is transitions. How we transition from activity to activity in a classroom, how we would transition at the beginning and the end of our time together. That can be really helpful to think about, keeping that calm and very predictable. Predictability in policies and procedures is helpful to a learner who feels like other aspects of life are out of control. That kind of predictability can be very helpful. Really supporting those executive functioning skills. It's tempting as instructors to say, at this point, you should know how to be organized. But the reality is that a lot of our learners still need support with organization and planning and time management. So the little ways that we can support that mixed in with our content, that's a good thing. And that idea of building self-worth is always a good one to pause on. The word choice that we use in class can build people up or go in the other direction. So that's a huge idea and a huge topic, but definitely one to mention here as an instructional consideration within a trauma-informed lens. I think all of these ideas really boil down to 4 big ideas, to be honest, if we can just kind of simplify. And there are other resources to get more into the nitty-gritty of those practical instructional practices that are evidence-based and helpful for folks with trauma. But if we talk about them as big ideas, this idea of caring and letting folks know it in your interactions and the resources that you share, pointing them to ways they can be supported and get help, acknowledging their lived experience in your classroom. All of these are ways to show we care. So once we care, we can be aware. You're taking a step in that direction right now by attending this session. I'm so grateful for it. Awareness is 95% of this battle. And then you can, like I said, dig deeper into what are some of these evidence-based practices that can really translate this in a practical way to what you do in your classroom. But being aware is an important step. Being flexible, you know, we've all been in discussions probably about the difference between equity and equality, and this concept that you can give everybody the same thing, but is that equitable if people need different things? Sometimes we use this image of folks looking out over a fence and some of the, you know, one of the persons is shorter than the other. So they need a bigger box to stand on, to look over the fence. I don't even really like that image because it's still kind of pointing to the person as having some kind of deficit. If we really think about equity and equality and flexibility and access, it's probably more appropriate to draw that picture with a pothole that somebody's standing in and therefore can't see over the fence. Because there are definitely systemic structural things that get in the way for some folks. When we talk about equity and diversity, we don't want to forget this idea of neurodiversity, these invisible ways that our brains are processing information and exhibiting what we know and engaging with instruction in different ways. Trauma is a piece of that. This could really require some flexibility as far as the instructor. If somebody needs to exemplify their mastery of knowledge and skills in a different way, or using different tools, or using a different timeline, why would we not want to do that? Because I think at the end of the day, the point is that mastery. We hold high expectations. None of this is about lowering our expectations for folks who have had adverse experiences. Certainly not. They deserve those high expectations too. They deserve that expectation that they will learn all of the content and be able to apply the skills. But when we talk about how, maybe there can be some flexibility there. And as we've mentioned before, if an instructor can just be in a position to be a bridge to resources, that's huge. Most of our learning institutions have a plethora of resources available for folks who are experiencing difficult things. So if we can be aware of that and point those towards our students, not in a way that maybe signals someone out, but in a way where we're giving it to all, and so therefore it's available to those who need it, then that is a great thing to be able to do. If there are other things coming to mind from your past experience or from your pondering right now that we can do as instructors to create a more trauma-sensitive environment, please feel free. Keep that chat box going and put your ideas there, and we can take a look at that as we proceed. I do also want to pause on this idea of secondary traumatic stress. But before I do that, let me take one step back even. We're talking about our students and our learners because we're here to serve them. But let's not also forget that we are in the same group of all people who have likely experienced traumatic events. So please apply these same awarenesses to yourself. Another aspect of this kind of self-care is this idea of secondary traumatic stress, where instead of it being your own experience or issue, you're experiencing a traumatic response based on the experience of someone else. So it could be a family member or a friend or a student, and you just can't shake what they're going through, and it's taking its toll on you and your mental health as well. It's important to be aware of that phenomena, to recognize it in yourself. If you're down, if you're feeling symptoms or emotions that we would attribute to depression or just really kind of that hyperarousal state that we talked about, where you're down and having trouble getting back up or getting motivated in your job or your life, you might want to think about whether secondary traumatic stress might be playing a role. And self-care is a big thing right now. We're being told to take care of ourselves. Everybody wants us to go to a yoga class and meditate and find time that, to do good things for ourselves. And I don't mean to sound disparaging of that. I think that's all so important, but it can also start to feel like another to-do list. And we're all pretty maxed out, I would think, if not before, then definitely now in this current context. So I would say, rather than kind of making a to-do list for ourselves, maybe we can think about self-care in regard to various dimensions. You can take a look at these dimensions and ask yourself, what would really work here for me or be meaningful for me? And what are the types of things I can do to kind of nurture these areas of my life? It sounds soft. It might not speak to your regular way of looking at things, especially if you're a pretty pragmatic, practical kind of person, which many of us instructors in the community college or post-secondary or CTE world are. But really just think about, especially now, how you can think of take care of yourself in regard to these dimensions. It's especially important to speak about because there are very unique challenges that are impacting instructors right now. We all have our own personal and family and community stressors going on. We all have also this different work situation where we're trying to really connect with students and share knowledge and skills from a distance often. And again, we talked about what that can mean. That can mean technological expectations, that can mean absorbing new work expectations, that can mean really having to be creative and work hard to convey what we know in ways that are less hands-on, that are more removed. We're talking through computer screens often. And even now as things start to be a bit more in person, sometimes the stressors that people are feeling can feel like 100-mile distance, even when you're in the same room. So again, being gentle and kind to yourself and recognizing these things and recognizing self-care is an important part of this formula. So really in conclusion, I think when we talk about trauma during fall of 2020 or any time, it just really requires a mind shift. Often when someone's behaving in a way or not regulating emotions or doing things that we don't understand, we can say, what's wrong with this person? Why is this person acting this way? It's a common natural human response, right? A trauma-informed lens moves us to first ask, wow, how has this person's experiences, either today or last week or early in their lifetime, how have their experiences impacted them and how they best learn? Because that's really the key, is understanding this neuroscience of when we are in our optimal window of performance and when we are not. And what does that mean for our instruction? What does that mean for flexibility and variance as we encourage learners to show and do what they've learned? Again, going back to this goal, I said it from the beginning, I wasn't shy about it, this goal of equity, this goal of making sure that we aren't just talking about educational access for some, we're talking about educational access for all. And neurodiversity stemming from our past experiences, our past adverse experiences, and how we cope with them is one aspect of this diversity promoting, equity providing approach to learning. And it's a process. So as you learn and discover new things and maybe think to yourself, oh, I've never thought about this before. That's actually our goal today, is to think about something you've never thought of before. Be gentle on yourself and realize that it's a process and that we're all learning and growing as we go. Teaching and learning is a human endeavor, and humans are by nature imperfect. So thus the need for continuous learning. And that's why I'm so grateful that you joined me today. Thanks for being here to open your mind to a new concept and idea in a new way. Keep sharing your thoughts as we wrap up in that chat box. Maybe I'll leave you with this final question of what did you hear or what did you learn today? That was a new idea. If you walk away with 1 or 2 or 3 of those, I think this was time well spent. So again, thank you everyone. My name is Shanna Shipman, and I am delighted to be with you today. Also, keep an eye out for the center's upcoming resources in relation to trauma. So I'm talking about the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support, one of the hosts of today. keep checking their website because we will have some additional webinars going more deeply into the concept of trauma-aware instruction. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for being here and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Shanna.